and I can supposedly go to hell based on whether I choose to believe that very low biblical evidence, let's call it 5%. Yet St. Thomas, the apostle, gets to stroll through the pearly gates, one assumes, on the back of not believing, assuming the Gospels are true here, even though he is presented with a level of evidence of, say, 85%. And Jesus then reversing this unbelief in the resurrection, Jesus' divinity and the whole atonement idea, not that Thomas actually would have understood this at the time, I wager, by getting Thomas to poke him and raising the evidential threshold to 95%. No, I'm making these figures up to illustrate my point. The Christian believer could counter that different people react differently to differing levels of evidence and concoct some kind of counter-apologetic. My general point would be, yes, all sorts of people will react differently to the same level of evidence, and all sorts of people get different levels of evidence. It's all a bit of an unfair mess. Time for another analogy. Imagine I have a class. Thank you very much. So you heard a little bit of an introduction there. A caveat I'm going to hit you with straight away is I've been really desperately ill for a week. And with my MS, my multiple sclerosis, I actually suddenly stopped being able to walk for a couple of days because the illness really hit me in lots of ways. Anyway, the point of me saying that is that if I start losing my train of thought or not being able to grab a word out from my brain somewhere, I'm going to pull out my disability card. But hopefully I'll be able to muddle my way through. So this is OmniGod on the Rack, and it's based on my last book, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan, and Divine Design. There are 30 arguments, or actually 31. I'm going to be covering as many as I can in the allotted time that I have, in the hope that, I can get through them all. I'm going to try and make sure that my screen, there we go. It doesn't seem to be particularly reactive. Anyway, thank you so much. Really kind for you to invite me here. Who am I? As you've just heard, I'm a philosopher. I'm a journalist at Only Sky. Only Sky Media is a brand new media organization to represent the non-religious, give them a view, give them a voice. And I've got a YouTube channel, a Tippling Philosopher, and ATP Geopolitics. So I'm pretty interested in that at the moment. I've written a bunch of books. There you go. Isn't that lovely? You can check them out. You don't have to read them as long as you just buy like 10 copies. That's cool. So as we get onto this topic, so I'm going to be dismantling this idea of God, hopefully. I mean, that's my intention. The question is, what is God? And the problem we have with defining God is that it's often a bit like a pea in a shell game, is that when you attack a certain type of God or certain understanding of God, the believer can often shift that version of God around so that it's the pea under the shell. And they say, well, that's not my version of God. This is my version of God. So then you attack this version, and then they move it around again. It's over there, and it's over there, and it's over there. And in the end, they give like a solution for one problem here that doesn't actually work with another solution they're given over there. And it all becomes just a tangled mess. So what I've done is taken what I call OmniGod, which is the God of classical theism. And this is defined as follows. So I define OmniGod as all-knowing, and that includes having divine foreknowledge. So this God knows the future of all freely willed events and decisions and anything in the future, if you believe in free will, that is. So that's a really important aspect of this God, knowing the future, as well as being all powerful. And I'm going to hit you with argument number 26, I think it is already. This is a bit of a bonus for you. Being all powerful means that you could, as a God, click your fingers and make something happen. Click your abstract fingers. Let's take the idea of Satan. A lot of people in the world believe in Satan, and it turns out that's just a terribly incoherent concept. And the reason why it's really incoherent is because if God is truly omnipotent, God could click God's fingers and disappear Satan like that. So anything that Satan does, so if you believe in this literalistic understanding of Satan, anything that Satan does is done on the behest of God in some sense. So Satan is God's middle manager. God could get rid of Satan if God wanted straight away, but apparently doesn't, according to such believers. And so therefore, whatever Satan does is done with God allowing it to happen, and therefore God desiring it to happen in some way. So when you hear a believer suddenly, say to you, oh, that's a temptation of Satan, or those fossils were put there by Satan, or whatever argument you might hear. I mean, straight away, it's just nonsense, because anything that Satan does has to be on the behest of God, because God, if God doesn't want something to happen, God would make that not happen. So anyway, God is all powerful, and God is all loving, sometimes infinite love. Some people say God is, God has so much love that it's overflowing. There's a superfluous amount of love in God, and that kind of bubbles over in the creation of the universe. So actually, let's get to the first argument then. And these first arguments are going to, and by the way, I am going to be rattling through arguments. Normally it takes me an hour and a half to talk about maybe 3 of these arguments. I'm going to try and do 20 in 60 minutes. So good luck me. Apologies if I talk really quickly and go at this in a gung-ho fashion. So the first bunch of arguments from part 1 of the book are being, design, and creation. And the first argument is, why would God create at all? And that's really, it's one of those, if you are a believer, it's one of those big questions. The sort of question that keeps me up at night is why is there anything at all, right? As a philosopher, that's like one of the key philosophical questions. Whereas as a believer, it's like, why would God create at all? And you get into certain problems concerning this, which is causally prior to creation, right? So this is God existing in God world before creating space-time. So God doesn't exist in time at this moment, causally prior to creation. God would exist just in God. We might call this God world. God world would be a state of ontological perfection. That means that literally, as far as existence goes, there's nothing more perfect than just this God existence. And if there is nothing greater than this God existence, if this was ontologically perfect, then why would God be in the business of degrading that perfection by creating something that is less than perfect? And if you look at sort of Adam and Eve or the world as it is, it appears that this is less than perfection. Why would God create at all? Especially when you consider that God in ontological perfection would have no lack, no desires. In order for God to have a lacking of something, God wouldn't be perfect. In order to God to have a desire, God would be lacking something. And that seems a little bit incoherent when you're considering ontological perfection. So if there's no lacks, no desires, then why would God want to create at all? And then you get a further couple of issues with this kind of idea, and this isn't really I don't talk about this hugely in my book. I talk about it in a book I wrote some years ago called Did God Create the Universe from Nothing? Countering William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument, which is to say that causally prior to creating the universe, there is no space-time. Someone like William Lane Craig, some of you might have heard of the theologian philosopher William Lane Craig, he talks about when God creates space-time, he enters into time. So prior to that, there is no time. So if there's no time, there can be no personhood, because all the attributes we might think about as included in the term personhood, and that's really difficult, long weeds of philosophy there. All of those attributes that God would have, like rationality, prediction, thinking, all of those things require time. Without time, you can't think. There just is. There's just this one instance, one atemporal instant, if you like. And so it would be really bizarre if God had any of the characteristics of personhood if you couldn't have time. And also, without time, it's really difficult to understand how you can have causation. So causation is sometimes seen as a change over time in certain aspects. I mean, causality is a very difficult philosophical concept, but a lot of philosophers will state that causality needs time. Well, if there was no time in God world, in this ontological perfection, not only would God have no desires to create anything, but actually causality couldn't even work without time. God almost couldn't cause time to come into being without time already existing. So anyway, those are just some side issues that you can think about over a pint later, or a coffee. So the second argument I'm going to talk about is God is a poor designer. So, okay, God has created the universe, and I've just whipped through the first argument in super quick time, but there's lots more to say about all the arguments I'm going to say. It's just going to give them a really quick seeing to. So God is a poor designer. Well, let's have a think about Adam and Eve. So most Christians, for example, and most sort of monotheists of the Abrahamic faith will believe in Adam and Eve. But even if you believe Adam and Eve are not literal but symbolic, the same issues exist. There's a two-horned dilemma with Adam and Eve. And I'm going to say Adam here as a shortcut for Adam and Eve. So I'm not being sexist, it's just quicker. So take Adam, right? If Adam is representative of humanity here, so say David, right, would make exactly the same choices that Adam made, then Adam would be representative of humanity. So God has created Adam and Eve, and they've made a mistake. They've eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, even though they never told off for that, and they hadn't even got the knowledge of good and evil. So actually doing what they did had no moral dimension because they didn't know good and evil. Anyway, that's a whole other thing to talk about another time. But anyway, so we've got this representative idea of Adam and Eve. They represent humanity, right? And whoever you plug into the Adam and Eve hole would make the same decisions. Okay. The other horn of the dilemma is that if Adam and Eve aren't representative of humanity, so if I put David into the Garden of Eden, David wouldn't make that same decision that Adam and Eve made, then it appears that we are being punished, or we have original sin based on a non-representative sample of humanity. And that is deeply unfair. So we are fallen, everything's all gone wrong. We've got this broken model of creation, and it's actually a non-representative sample of humanity that has got us into this problem here. So the two horns of the dilemma are either Adam and Eve are not representative, and that's deeply unfair, or Adam and Eve are representative, in which case, no matter what human you put into that position, into that situation, they would have made the same mistakes. In other words, God is a rubbish designer, because God is designing something that is broken, just a broken model concept of design. And this gets onto problems in a little while when we talk about atonement and aspects like that. But let's just look at that a little bit and draw an analogy. This is one I like, which is a lab scientist analogy. So imagine David is some crazy clever lab scientist working in his lab, and he's created almost out of nothing, he's created in his lab these sentient creatures, right? And a whole host of sentient creatures come out the test tubes, but at the design stage, David knows 100% indubitably that these sentient life forms that he's designed in order that they do this will break out the test tubes, break out the lab, run into the local village, and they will rape and murder and steal and cause absolute havoc. Some of them might do nice things, give to charity, and I don't know, be kind to some locals, but most of them are horrible. So let's look at that. If the police were looking at what had happened here, surely they would have a very good right to go back to David as this crazy clever scientist and say, hang on, you knew indubitably before you created these. In fact, you designed these creatures such that they did this. They broke out, caused mayhem. Like, I know you might say they've got free will, but you designed them in a way that you knew they would do that. You, David, are morally culpable in some sense for what these sentient creatures have gone and done. And I would map that back onto God. If God has full divine foreknowledge as this designer, God is a poor designer, but is also morally culpable for what has happened. There's another analogy we can talk about, which is a car CEO analogy. So if, again, David, I'm sorry I'm picking on you, mate, because I don't know anyone else in the audience, but you're a good victim. So David is the CEO of a car company, and he designs and creates cars. He's not only the CEO, he's a designer, right? And the manufacturer. He does everything. He's super good at cars. So he designs a car that he knows 100% will break down and cause crashes and will eventually kill people. He knows that 100%. Right? He still designs cars like that, and he still creates those cars and sells them to the general public. Now, we would absolutely, with the laws we have and the morality we have and the ordinary morality that we all possess, we would take David to court if that happened. If he's designed and sold cars that would break and cause death and harm to other people. Like, that is the moral culpability of the CEO. This is what we do in court cases the world over. I would suggest that God is morally culpable for the poor design of humanity. So God is morally culpable for our sin, and that is the connection there. And this also makes atonement make sense, because so atonement is the idea that somehow the sins of Jesus, this is very, very Christian centric here, this part, but the idea that Jesus pays for the sins of humanity is a really bizarre idea. Like, and actually it's a core central component in Christianity, and it makes no sense. I discussed this in my book on the resurrection. I say, look, the historical aspects of the resurrection don't make any sense, and they are problematic, but you can't even get over the problem of the Trinity not making any sense and atonement not making any sense. The car company CEO, David, sells his cars out to the general public. They break down and kill people. And then David demands that the general public give him payment for those cars that he designed and that broke down and crashed. He demands from a third party payment for that poor design. That's the massive incoherence of the atonement as a general concept. God is morally culpable for our sin, because we didn't create ourselves, we didn't design ourselves. He knew it would happen 100%, and yet, he designs and he creates us anyway, and then demands payment for the sins that he knew that we would do and designed in such a way that we would do. So there you go. Demanding payment for his own faulty design is a real problem. Anyway, that's arguments 2, 5, and 6 there. He ends up paying himself for problems he has designed and created. And I think that doesn't make a lot of sense. So the next argument is that, this is going backwards a little, I've linked a couple of arguments there. Argument number 4 is that God loves abortion. That sounds really odd. The reason I like this argument is because it really annoys pro-life Christians who are kind of often holier than thou type people who have very I don't know, they cherry pick their morality and have double standards, which is to say, I really care about this entity being born, but once it's born, I generally don't care about it. And I'm on to the next sort of picket line, rather than thinking, okay, well, if I really care about this life, let's think about the welfare state that's going to look after this child or help to look after this child so this child flourishes. Let's think about parenting. Let's think about all these things that go into really giving a flourishing life, not just being pro-birth. And anyway, this argument is interesting because anywhere up to 75% of fertilized eggs are lost. So somewhere between fertilization and a baby being born at the end of the full term, there are an awful lot of ways that a fertilized egg cannot either they don't implant, or they're lost in early blastocyst, or they're lost as fetuses and miscarriages. It's difficult to get a decent number on this, but there's most guesstimates are somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of all fertilized eggs are lost. Now it doesn't even matter if it's 20%, 10%, whatever. Like, the reality is that over time with humanity, literally billions of fertilized eggs have been lost up to fetus, up to pretty much almost being born as a baby. Now, this is pretty interesting, because if you are a pro-life Christian, for example, you're generally arguing that these are human beings. Don't get me started on the whole human being personhood argument and debate. But let's just grant them that these are human beings. Why would God design a system knowingly such that billions of human beings die before even being born? It's just an absolutely insane. So it's like pro-life Christians, if you are having a go, if you're picketing at lines at family planning at a Planned Parenthood clinic, have a little look. Those living in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Have a little look at your own God and say, what's going on there? And really, what generally happens in these arguments is that the Christian comes back with, oh, God has the right to take life. And that's basically, and they say that because that's all they've got. You can understand the kind of cognitive dissonance going on in their minds, which is like, how do I justify the fact that God appears to have designed a system where billions of babies die over time? And yeah, it's just really problematic when God has divine foreknowledge. I think divine foreknowledge of God, future knowledge of future events, is one of the biggest character flaws of God. And I can understand why there are theists who are moving towards a different idea of God, one of open theism, which is that God doesn't know future events. But then it's all a bit sort of, well, God's just playing with dice here, and creation appears to be just a little bit random. Okay, next argument as I rattle through. How am I doing for time? Goodness me, I'm going to run out of time. Why don't we photosynthesize? So this is another design argument. When you look at carnivorousness around the world, and I remember watching a video, I made myself watch it, of a baby water buffalo being eaten alive by a pride of lions. And they were literally ripping this living animal limb from limb as it was kind of screaming. It was heartbreaking. And I felt I had to watch this to understand what the problem of evil is in this context, and which is like, why is there suffering in the world, given that God is supposedly all loving, all knowing, and all powerful? God would be loving enough to do something about it, powerful enough to be able to do something about it, and knowledgeable enough to know what to do about it, but doesn't do anything about it. It seems really weird that there is carnivorousness at all. Why would God design a system whereby it is necessary for certain animals to cause suffering and death in other animals merely to survive? That's a really bizarre. So this is where we talk about, I want to talk at the beginning about abductive arguments. Abductive arguments are inferences to the best explanation. What that means is that when we have competing hypotheses, what better explains the data? So in this case, like when you have carnivorousness, is that better explained by OmniGod, who is all-loving God? Or is it better explained by naturalistic evolution? I would argue every day of the week it's naturalistic evolution. You can flip that. Which hypothesis better predicts the data? So if you started with God is love, right? And say, okay, God is love, what would I predict the universe to look like? I can guarantee it wouldn't include black holes, Ebola, cancer, plate tectonics with tsunamis killing 240,000 people, and it wouldn't include carnivorousness. So what is better predicted? Which hypothesis better predicts carnivorousness? I would say naturalistic atheism. So I think that's a really strong argument to say that why do we have carnivorousness? Why is it that God couldn't have designed us to photosynthesize? Why couldn't we get our energy from the sun? Even if God couldn't play around with the physical constants of this universe, he could actually change the constants such that we could derive enough energy from the sun, or just do perpetual miracles all the time so that we can just get energy from the sun just magically. And there you go. We don't need carnivorousness. We don't need the suffering and death of other animals to survive. Pain and death appear necessary just for mere survival. And then you start getting onto other arguments. Why other kind of ideas? Why do we even need energy at all? Why do we need corporeal existence? And then you get on, and this is an argument I come to much later, which is, why not just create us in heaven? If heaven's the end goal, just create us in heaven. If you know who's going to get to heaven and who's going to go to hell, don't create the people that are going to go to hell. Just create the people that are going to go to heaven, and don't create us on this world where there's going to be pain and suffering. If the end goal is this eternity in heaven, just take those people, right, and just create them in heaven. Job done. And you, God, you have experiential knowledge, possibly, which is you can have knowledge. You can almost experience creation without creating. You can imagine it, and you can say, "What if I created all these people? This would happen. These people would go to hell. But I don't need to create. I can experience that without creating it because I'm OmniGod." And so, okay, I've enjoyed that kind of carnivorousness, plate tectonics, people dying, and Ebola. I've enjoyed that, but I didn't actually create it. I just imagined it. And now I'm going to take those people that I knew were going to go to heaven, just create them in heaven. Anyway, that's a later argument. That's a bonus, early doors, because I didn't think we were going to get onto the afterlife. Anyway, God has no free will. Argument number 8. So if God has infallible foreknowledge, right? So that means that if God knows he's going to have a cup of tea at 9:30 on next Tuesday morning, it means that when it gets to 9:30 next Tuesday morning, God absolutely has to have that cup of tea. Because if God doesn't have that cup of tea, then his foreknowledge would have been fallible, which means that God doesn't have omniscience. If God has omniscience, he not only knows the future events of that which he creates, the world, people, entities, you and I, not only knows the future of all of those things, but he knows his own future, which is to say that I know exactly what I'm going to do every point in my existence from now until the end of until forever, for eternity. Now, this is really interesting because it then just means that God is an automaton. God has absolutely no free will. Even if you believe in free will, which I don't, libertarian free will, God can't have it because God knows exactly what he will do, and he cannot choose otherwise because he's also completely constrained by his own omni characteristics. So if he's all loving, he has to do that which is all loving at all times. And in fact, if he's OmniGod, then there's an argument to say that he can't even think. Like, thinking and deliberating is inefficient rationality. It's like, oh, I wonder, should I do this? Should I do that? And an idea pops into my head. And then I think like this. God would be like a computer. All calculations would be known in advance, actually. There would be like, there just is. So God would be, I would argue, this trolley on train tracks going through time without being able to deviate from those train tracks in any way, shape, or form. Any deviation from what he knows he will do himself would invalidate his own divine foreknowledge. So I think that's a pretty powerful argument. And, you know, again, all of these arguments take about an hour to really dissect, and I'm doing it in a couple of minutes. So God and this world are immutable. So taking that into account, if God has full future foreknowledge of this entire universe, then there is no way that this universe can be any other way than God knows it will be. So if you believe in OmniGod, if you believe God is truly omniscient, then there is nothing you can do or anyone can do or even God can do to change what he already knows will happen. This, of course, invalidates things like prayer for asking people. I mean, this is an argument that comes later in the book that I wasn't going to get onto today, but it's a good time to bring it up, which is there's no point in praying to God to change anything. Oh, please, my Aunt Doris has got cancer. Please, can you make her better from cancer? It's not like God's sitting up there and going, oh, that's a great idea. Do you know what? I thought Doris was just going to get cancer forever and die, but you've changed my opinion. That's really good. I hadn't thought of that. I'm going to let her live. That's never going to happen because God already knows of all future events and can't change that foreknowledge of those future events. And so there's no point praying to ask God to change a state of affairs. There is nothing God can do. The world cannot be changed from what God knows it will be. Okay, as we whip on, we go on to part 2, why we believe or not. So here we get onto an argument of the accidents of geography and history. It's sort of quite similar to, there's a great book by John Loftus called The Outsider Test for Faith, talks a lot about this, but ideas of like, if you are born in a time and place that had no access to God's revelation, so say you're an Amazonian tribes person living in 5000 BCE, you're never going to read the Hebrew Bible, you're never going to read the Christian Bible, you're going to have no idea about any of these things. Well, then how do you get to heaven? And then how is it fair that this person cannot access, if the Christian would, or the Jew or the Muslim will have to argue that there must be some benefit to believing in this religious system, right? Otherwise, it seems bizarre. There must be some benefit you get. Well, if you're born in a time and a place where you can't access that at all, then that seems inherently unfair. And this kind of religious diversity argument, where if you're born in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia today, or 50 years ago, or whenever, you are almost certainly going to be a Muslim. But what if Christianity is a true religion? Nothing you have done. You haven't chosen to be born where you're born, and you don't have any power over where you're born. And yet you're born into this place, and you adopt the dominant religion, unless you are just happen to be really, really lucky. And so this plays merry havoc with the ideas of God's fairness. Now, people like, again, William Lane Craig here, his solution to this is almost laughable. His solution is that, well, it could be that God knows in advance who will come to freely love him and who will come to freely reject him. And he knows in advance that, I don't know, all this whole array of souls, if you believe in a soul, I don't, but the Christians generally will, or theists, many theists will. all these souls will come to freely reject God. And so therefore, I'm going to front load these souls into Amazonian tribes people and all these people who lived in a time and place that couldn't access the true God's revelation and love. And so therefore, all these people were just created and then will eventually maybe go to hell or be annihilated or whatever. They don't get to enjoy the good stuff. It's like, that's your idea of how to solve that problem, Craig? Because that seems like God is creating people such that they go to hell, irrespective of, whether they have the power. I mean, they have no power to change their state of affairs. God knows in advance before creating that they will go to hell, and then plugs them into all these areas where they can't access God's love and revelation. It seems, just morally abhorrent to me. Of course, if you don't believe in that version of hell, the kind of literalistic old school version of hell, then call it annihilationism, where that soul just gets annihilated or whatever. They don't get the good stuff. That still is unfair. So that's an argument from geography and history about the unfairness of God's creation. Then we get to other issues of unfairness. Here, it's the unfair levels of evidence. Let's take doubting Thomas. So doubting Thomas, according to the Gospel of John, is this scenario whereby Thomas goes, do you know what? Even though we've been hanging out for ages and I've seen you do loads of miracles and I believe that you're this super special guy, you're the son of God, or you are God, all this kind of stuff, because John's theology was a little bit more sophisticated than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And even though I know all this, says Thomas, and all these other guys seem to be pretty convinced that you're resurrected, I don't believe you. I don't believe you've been resurrected. I don't believe it's you. And then Jesus says, put your fingers in my holy hands. And Thomas touches Jesus. And then he's like, oh, yeah, okay. No, I believe now. Oh, that's good. And this is a really interesting story because, Thomas ends up being St. Thomas and, whatever. It depends what you believe. But the idea is that he gets to go to heaven or get all the good stuff or believe in Jesus. And he's given a level of evidence that you and I and everyone on earth will not even come close to being privileged to have. So he knew he had more evidence of Jesus than any of us will ever have, and still didn't believe that was Jesus resurrected. And yet he gets to touch Jesus, have these experiences of Jesus that change his belief. And then he comes to his senses and believes in Jesus being resurrected. We don't have that. I don't have that. I've got a 2,000-year-old book and I'm expected of unknown providence, and I'm expected to take it hook, line and sinker and believe in Jesus. And, heaven and hell could be on the line for this kind of decision, this belief decision. It's just unfair that that's just one example. People all over the world get different amounts of evidence for whatever religion it may be, and are then apparently, it seems, judged on that basis, of your faith. And it seems that there's an unfair distribution of evidence that is really, really problematic. And I've got a classroom analogy that I like to that I include in the book that I think is really useful for explaining this. So do forgive me for reading out a little bit from the book, but I think it does justice to what I'm trying to say here. Okay. Hear me out. So, and I can supposedly go to hell based on whether I choose to believe that very low biblical evidence, let's call it 5%. Yet St. Thomas, the apostle, gets to stroll through the pearly gates, one assumes, on the back of not believing, assuming the gospels are true here, even though he is presented with a level of evidence of, say, 85%. And Jesus then reversing this unbelief in the resurrection, Jesus' divinity and the whole atonement idea, not that Thomas actually would have understood this at the time, I wager, by getting Thomas to poke him and raising the evidential threshold to 95%. No, I'm making these figures up to illustrate my point. The Christian believer could counter that different people react differently to differing levels of evidence and concoct some kind of counter-apologetic. My general point would be, yes, all sorts of people will react differently to the same level of evidence, and all sorts of people get different levels of evidence. It's all a bit of an unfair mess. Time for another analogy. Imagine I have a class of 30 children to whom I give a test. All 30 children have different brains, knowledge bases, abilities and thresholds, etc. I give them a test of 100 questions and declare that the children who fail to get 70 out of 100 will get detention. So that's like hell, obviously. Children who get 70 will get a special treat, heaven. I then give them a test, except I also give out different cheat sheets to everyone, ranging from 0 points of help to 95 points. Each child either gets no extra help or gets some kind of leg up to getting close to that 70-point success. Some people, like little Thomas, get a cheat sheet that answers with answers worth 95 points. Lucky him. Poor Alice, who's not very clever due to her genetics and troublesome environment, gets a cheat sheet worth 0 points of help and gets 16 out of 100 and detention. We could actually make this more accurate. Some children are given trickster cheat sheets, like our Saudi student, Mo, who gets a sheet that actually tells him wrong answers and leaves him with 35 points less than he would have got on his own. He gets 50 and receives a detention. Perhaps as a teacher, I actually take in the answers, but don't announce to anyone the results until the end of the school day. In the meantime, I plug the results into a matrix that calculates an outcome based on 1, abilities, 2, environment, 3, cheat sheets, and 4, their results. I then use these calculated results to enforce on them a detention or a reward. The idea is that everyone's got this different array. Everyone sits on the spectrum of evidence somewhere, and God somehow judges us as to whether we believe enough or not, one assumes, and yet we are doled out completely differing amounts of evidence that, again, just shows that God appears to be exceptionally unfair. Lots more to say on that, but I will move on. Think up some questions for the Q&A later. Again, in part 2, why we believe or not. Some people are more likely to believe than others, or not. So it turns out that statistically, women are more likely to believe than men in God. It doesn't really matter what the reasons are. You can talk about, there's lots of really interesting research into this. There are theories that there's some research to suggest that certain autistic people are less likely to believe in a personal God than neurotypical people. And again, whatever the reasons for these are, it doesn't really matter. The simple point to make here is that certain subsets of humans are less likely to believe in God than other subsets of humans. And essentially speaking, that is unfair. I could give you a logical syllogism that expresses this, but the idea is that, statistically, there are certain groups. If you're born a man, you are less likely to believe in God than if you're born a woman, on average. And therefore, that appears, again, to show that God is unfair. Why? Why would God create a scenario where certain subsets of people are less likely to believe in him or not, or her or it? And it goes back to these abductive argument scenarios, which is what better explains the data. OmniGod theism. The correct OmniGod theism. Would God create a universe whereby a bunch of people are more likely to believe in him than another bunch of people? Or would he make it completely fair so that everyone gets a fair crack of the whip? I would say that kind of religious pluralism and evidential pluralism and belief pluralism is better supported by the hypothesis of naturalistic atheism. So there you go. And we get on to part 3, the moral life. Arguments against divine command theory. I'm not going to go through that. That's like an hour and a half just on its own. Humans do not have free will. That's a whole free will argument debate. That takes an hour and a half. The Bible is not a good source of morality. That's another argument I talk about. Again, I won't go through that because lots of people know those arguments. Pick some terrible passages in the Bible. It's not a good source of morality. In fact, we can do a better job of morality by just looking at the UN Charter of Human Rights. I would take the UN Charter of Human Rights over the Bible any day of the week. However, the next argument, this is quite interesting. What the Holy Book forgets to say, holy books forget to say, and I'm going to choose the Bible here, but it doesn't have to be the Bible, it'd be the Quran. I've read the Quran. It's morally very problematic. And the Hebrew Bible is obviously, part of the Christian Bible. So just take something like slavery. Slavery is a really, really problematic idea in the Bible because, in my opinion, I would ditch the Bible on slavery alone. You don't need to, I need to know nothing else in the Bible about the Bible other than it countenances slavery at many points in the Bible. That is enough for me to reject that as any kind of moral, guide. But it's also what the Bible doesn't say. So at no point did Moses come down from Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. It depends on which verse you read. It comes down from Mount Sinai and says, I've got these tablets and they've got some really good rules on. The first rule is don't do slavery. And then rule number 2, it's in capitals. It says, and God made me chisel this out. And he said, really, honestly, don't do slavery. Slavery sucks. It is obviously really bad. Using humans for your own ends in this way is morally abhorrent. If that was in the Decalogue, in the 10 Commandments, number 1 and 2, right, no one would have any lack of clarity as to whether slavery is outlawed in the Bible or not. But what's happened since is that the Bible has been used to justify slavery for 1,900 of the last 2,000 years. And with that kind of lack of moral clarity, it calls into question the revelation that is the Bible in this case. Medical information, the Bible doesn't say, do you know what, by the way, because I'm God and I know everything, and this is the inspired word of God that's coming through people, and these are prophets that I can put anything in their brains, like I am God, I'm OmniGod, right? This prophet is going to say to you, by the way, if you're doing any surgery, don't forget to boil the tools first. And this prophet is going to say, here's the germ theory of reality. They don't say that. And no prophecies say anything particularly useful as well. Prophecies all in the Bible, they say, oh, this war's going to happen and this person's going to win the war. It's like, well, anyone could predict that. And in fact, most of the prophecies in the Bible are recognized now to be ex eventu Vaticanum, which means that they are written after the fact. So they're written about this war, and then they're predated to before the war. And it's like, oh, look, I predicted the war. And this was actually written 200 years ago, and it wasn't. It was written after the war, and it's not a prediction. It's just a description. But there's no prophecies about intercontinental ballistic missiles or Netflix or, I don't know, vaccines. There's no useful prophecies or prophecies that make you go, damn it, they knew. There's no way they could have prophesied like helicopters without, really knowing something. But that's not in there at all. So it's what the Bible doesn't say that I think's interesting. Then we get on to the problem of evil arguments. These are arguments to do with suffering. Evil. When I say evil here, I mean evil is a bit of a nebulous term. Basically, just suffering. Natural evil shows God's shadier side, right? Natural evil. So we often talk about the problem of evil, which, as I said, is why is there so much suffering, given that God is caring enough to want to do something about it, knowledgeable enough to know what to do about it, and powerful enough to be able to do something about it, and yet there's suffering. And you can talk about any unit of suffering from the smallest to the biggest. You can talk about the biggest genocide or you stubbing your toe in the morning, right? If you stub your toe in the morning, that, if you believe in OmniGod, that cannot be gratuitous. That stubbing of your toe, and sometimes it's worth thinking about the smallest bits of pain as opposed to the biggest. You're stubbing your toe in the morning cannot be gratuitous, because even if that small unit is unnecessary, God cannot be all loving. There will be gratuitous suffering, which invalidates God's omni characteristics. So therefore, that needs explaining. Every unit of pain and suffering needs explaining in light of OmniGod. So you stubbing your toe needs to have an explanation for it. But the best arguments concerning the problem of evil aren't things to do with like genocide and Hitler and this and that, because they involve humans, and then humans get blamed. It's like free will or this, soul building theodicy. These are called theodicies, ways of explaining why so much suffering exists in light of OmniGod. So it's like, it's a collateral of having free will. We've got free will and you can make bad decisions. Hitler had free will, and yeah, you can do wonderful things, but people make bad decisions, but it's still worth happening, even though it caused like 6 million Jews to die or whatever, right? Godwin's law, I've mentioned Hitler. So the power of natural evil arguments is that it bypasses these sorts of theodicies, and they become really, really powerful problem of evil arguments. So in this case, sorry, my computer's just gone a bit funky. It can also lead to arguments that all sentient animals require an afterlife. So if you talk about a fawn dying in a forest fire, like a baby deer dying in a forest fire over 3 days, or there's tsunami, 240,000 humans died in that, but countless billions of animals, the forest fires, the wildfires in Australia, killing literally billions of animals. And you're thinking, how is it fair that those animals go through all that pain and suffering? And the way that theists generally justify pain and suffering for humans is by saying, oh, it's all balanced in heaven. It's okay. It all gets balanced in heaven. Not a problem. But you can't do that for animals. So for theists to be consistent, they really should argue that every sentient animal that can feel pain has to go to heaven. And there's no other way around it as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, natural evil arguments include things like, carnivorousness. Why is there carnivorousness? Why are there tsunamis that kill all these things? Why are there forest fires? But also there are other things that are quite interesting to consider, not necessarily in the same sort of dimension as maybe carnivorousness, but these involve humans. But things like, I've got multiple sclerosis, right? If I was an all-loving Christian, if I was a believing Christian, why would God give me MS? Why would God give people any kind of disease or condition? Phobias. What are the point of phobias? I've got, I think it's called trypophobia. I have a phobia of like loads of holes together, and it makes my brain fizz and go mental. It's like a really weird phobia. It's the only one I have, but it freaks me out. And I did a video on this recently because I was like, this is really interesting. Why would this exist? Again, abductive argument. What would you predict on OmniGod theism? What would you predict with naturalistic atheism? What better explains phobias? Why would God create humans with phobias, with debilitating mental conditions that mean they can't do things or they struggle to do things, can't go outside, can't talk to people, can't do this, can't be like this? What better explains phobias or any kind of mental or physical ailments? I would say naturalistic atheism and evolution does a really good job of explaining all of them. OmniGod theism does a very bad job at explaining all of them. And then there's something called the Darwinian problem of evil argument. How much time have I got? Oh my goodness, I'm struggling. So the Darwinian problem of evil argument looks like this, and I'll explain this. So this might seem a bit like, oh my goodness, syllogism. So the argument is God is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good. The evil of extensive animal suffering exists. Necessarily, God can actualize an evolutionarily perfect world. Necessarily, God can actualize an evolutionarily perfect world only if God does actualize an evolutionarily perfect world. 5, necessarily, God actualized an evolutionarily perfect world. Okay, what does all that mean? Well, a quick explanation of that, and this is a pretty powerful argument, is as follows. Let me just find my place in the book. So 5 follows from 3 and 4, but we have a contradiction since 5 and 2 cannot both be true. So it appears that 1 is false. The argument is to say that, and here I explain it, the argument is to say that God could predict the mechanisms of evolution and design one in which animal suffering is minimized. This scenario can be called an evolutionary perfect world. We could imagine a scenario where God could put in place an evolutionary system whereby, for example, just before a gazelle is given a killing bite by a lion, a gene is expressed that naturally tranquilizes the gazelle, or some other such similar situation. But this appears not to be the case. Instead, we have extensive animal suffering that is hard-baked into the evolutionary system and the world. In other words, evolution doesn't look to be perfect. This is not an evolutionarily perfect world. Suffering is not minimized by evolution. Therefore, this is a very powerful argument that OmniGod doesn't exist. And you could talk about carnivorousness there again. Okay, let's move on to another one. Where is God hiding? These are arguments of divine hiddenness, really powerful arguments, divine hiddenness. They're getting a lot more popular at the moment. J.L. Schellenberg philosophers express them really, really well. God has apparently been on holiday for 2,000 years and not really answering the phone much. Divine hiddenness. So what is divine hiddenness? Well, it can be God not being there, like being absent for 2,000 years, but also being absent for individuals, people experiencing doubts, even though they are committed believers. These are called non-resistant non-believers, or non-resistant believers in this case. They really want, they're not resisting believing. They're just experiencing doubts or spiritual dryness. That's always a weird term. Spiritual dryness, meaning I just don't feel it. These people are telling me how they feel it when they get an altar call. I don't feel it. It all looks a bit fake. And I'm not making myself, I can't make myself feel these things. Unrewarding prayers and rituals. I pray, but I don't hear anything back. Catastrophes with no God. Great examples of these throughout time. There's a writer that talked a lot about Christian converts in Japan who are persecuted for their Christianity, and they're crying out, being tortured, and then God didn't save them. God didn't help them. And why is God absent? If these are people, these are believers who are calling out for God, and God is absent. And these are people that want God to be there. But you also, non-resistant non-believers also include people that may be born in the Amazonian rainforest in 5000 BC again. If they'd been born in Jerusalem in around Jesus' time, they would have been the biggest Jesus believer. But actually, they just didn't get that chance. Now, if non-resistant non-believers exist, so these are people who are not resistant to believing, they would believe if they were given a chance. They're just not given the chance to believe in the right God at the right time. Then if these non-resistant non-believers exist, then it's very difficult to argue that OmniGod exists, because it seems a really bizarre thing for God to do, to make a bunch of people that would believe in him be born into places and times and scenarios where they don't believe in him. And then there's this other argument to do with how these abstract answers, these theodicies, why there is so much evil and suffering, don't overcome experiential problems. It's a bit like saying, I won't get into that actually, because I am running short of time, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. So here are some syllogisms for divine hiddenness. God has allowed himself to remain hidden from many people. It would be bad for an omnipotent, omniscient God to remain hidden or to keep his reasons for being hidden from anyone. God, being perfectly good, cannot do anything that is bad. Therefore, there is no God. Those are the kind of divine hiddenness arguments. And again, William Lane Craig will say, well, actually, I say that there aren't non-resistant non-believers. These would have always rejected God, and therefore God knew that, and just God plants them in these scenarios whereby they'll end up not believing in God, and that's his way around that. Okay, part 5, the afterlife. We are just getting into afterlife arguments, which is a whole massive thing. I'll just give you a couple to whet our appetite, and then that's the end of the talk. Goodness me, time has flown. The soul doesn't exist. I'm not going to talk about that. That's a massive, massive talk just in and of itself. But the soul is a thoroughly problematic concept for a whole host of reasons. But my next argument in the book is, what's the point in heaven and hell? Like, if God knows in advance who's going to go to heaven, who's going to go to hell, why bother with heaven and hell? Why bother with hell? If you have this understanding of this traditional notion of hell, and this is problematic, the heaven and hell are suitably vague in the Bible, which means that actually people make up whatever they like to be heaven and hell, and they can just about get away with defending that in the Bible because it's suitably underdetermined. But if you talk about the kind of binary option of going to paradise forever or going to some horrible existence forever, or even annihilated forever, what is the point, particularly with hell? Like, if God knows in advance that David's going to go to hell, right? He said, right, David's not even been created yet. I'm just in the design phase. Yeah, David's oh God, David's going to hell. Yeah, actually, I'm thinking about it. He's really going to hell. Anyway, sorry about that, David. I'm going to create you anyway. And he creates David, and David goes through his life, and he has a pain and suffering of the normal human life. And then at the end of that, he goes to hell for eternity. It's like, what's the point of that? Why did you do that? You didn't need to do that. Why did you do that? When we punish people in prison, there are three elements to punishment: deterrence, and actually that's really problematic. Turns out that the harsher the punishment is, it doesn't affect deterrence. It's a very minimal effect on deterrence. Retribution, haha, you deserve that, you bad moral person, you're going to go to prison. And rehabilitation, right, we're going to send you to prison, but we understand why you did that stuff. We understand causally why you became a criminal, and we need to rehabilitate you if we can, to successfully reintegrate you to society, if we can, if that's doable. However, if you're committed to hell for eternity, there is no rehabilitation. What is the point of just eternally punishing someone? This is called ECT, eternal conscious torment, and it is a real problem. And so you're now starting to get Christians, for example, and other theists who are becoming universalists, who will say, yeah, the idea of eternal conscious torment is so problematic that actually we're going to ditch that idea of hell. And I would go along with that. If I was a Christian, I would ditch that. Hell is really problematic. Okay, the afterlife. God cannot be perfectly merciful and perfectly just. This is a really easy, really quick argument. These are mutually exclusive characteristics that many theists claim about God. He's perfectly merciful, perfectly just. But I define this to mean just, meaning acting or being in conformity with what is merited or deserved. So you get what you deserve. If I'm punishing you and I'm being just about it, you get what you deserve. On the other hand, merciful means acting with forbearance shown, especially to an offender or to someone subject to one's power, acting leniently or compassionately. You don't get what you deserve. I'm going to be lenient with you. So how can God be perfectly merciful and perfectly just at the same time? God can't be. All these kind of concepts that theists ascribe to God are so thoroughly problematic. Anyway, that's just a little easy argument there. And we're just getting on to the last couple of arguments I might have time for. Weighing our hearts, heaven or hell. So how do we get judged as to whether we go to heaven or hell? These binary, it's so problematic, a binary. You've got the whole spectrum of behavior on earth, and yet you either go into the good pot or the bad pot. I mean, that alone is hugely problematic. Is it faith? Is it works? If it's just faith that gets you into heaven, then you could be a complete bastard, right, for all your life, but say, hey, I believe in God, and you believe in the right kind of God, but you're just not very nice, and you get to go to heaven. But what if you're the nicest human being on earth? You're just so nice, but you don't believe in God. Do you go to hell on? Okay, so the other end of the other option is it your works? Well, if I'm a really nice guy, I get to go to heaven. It doesn't matter whether I believe in God or not. But then, of course, you don't need to believe in God. Like, faith is pointless. The revelation of the Bible is kind of pointless as to, the idea that you need to be born again. All these sort of theistic concepts are rendered impotent in this scenario. So there's a real issue, and this is a long-running theological issue here as to whether it's faith or works or both, and how they interact with each other. So as I've hopefully expressed, it's really problematic. What if the threshold is 50%? If you get over 50%, you get to go to heaven. What if you're 49.9% and you get to go to hell, but you're in hell with people who are 1%? And do you get the same punishment? Are you eternally punished, even though that you're 49.8% nicer than that other guy? What if you're 50.1% good? You just scrape into heaven, and you get to enjoy all the paradise with the people who have been super good, 99.9% good. What about babies? And you get these weird scenarios as well, where you get so there's something in philosophy called possible worlds, right? Let's have possible world 1 and world 2. In world 1, David goes to heaven, right? No, sorry. In world 1, David goes to hell, right? David's a non-believer. He goes to hell. Sorry, David, you're in eternity in hell. However, God could create world 2, which has slightly different scenarios going on there. And it just so happens that David in that world ends up believing in God and doing some nice things, and he gets into heaven in world 2. Now, God knows the counterfactuals of all the possible worlds, which means he knows what would happen if he created any possible world, but he's chosen to create W1. Now, there's an argument to say it's unfair on David if God chooses to create the world in which David goes to hell rather than the world in which David goes to heaven. Well, that's really unfair. There are plenty of possible worlds where David gets the good stuff, but God has chosen the world to create where David gets the bad stuff. It's a really interesting thought experiment there. There's loads of mileage in stuff like this. And this will be, I guess, I've run out of time. So this is going to be my last argument. Actually, just before that, I'm going to read a quote. This is an actual quote from a friend of mine's pastor that is just blew my mind, right? And this is about faith versus works, right? This is Pastor Michael Caesar. He says, not that I would ever do this, but if you gave me an AK-47 right now and enough ammo to take you all out, and before I did it, I started blaspheming the Holy Ghost's name, yeah, because that's worse than shooting people in the face with an AK-47. I started blaspheming the Holy Ghost's name and then took you out and then put the gun in my mouth, I still end up in heaven. Sorry, that probably wouldn't happen as before I got to do it. The Lord would stop me. He might take me out before I got my finger on the trigger, but that's the power of the salvation. It's all the work of the Lord. So he's like, hey, I'm saved. I'm saved. So it doesn't matter what I do. I can shoot my entire congregation and it wouldn't matter. I'm saved. Really? I was just waxing lyrical about some issue. I was just going to finish off with my final one about if I had dementia. So I don't know whether you have the wherewithal for me to continue my last argument at all, or go ahead. Yeah, as long as you guys can hear me. I mean, it's through my phone. Goodness, hope it's all right. So I was just talking about how an 80-year-old with dementia who might die. So say I had dementia at the age of 80 and then died. Then what represents me in heaven? Is it is it the mind that I died with? So if I'd lost all my faculties, how do I get represented in heaven? This is where actually all the arguments about the soul are quite important that we haven't gone through. But the idea is that if I have a soul, it needs, and that's what represents me in heaven, that needs to be somehow causally connected to me on a daily basis, such that if I do good stuff or bad stuff, it's a soul that is actually doing that through me, because otherwise it's unfair to punish the soul or reward the soul. So there are loads of arguments to do with the soul here. But however, what represents me in heaven? So if I've lost my marbles and I go to heaven, do I just get to walk around heaven without my mental faculties? What about if if I die as a baby? What represents me in heaven? Like, is it some kind of perfect version of me? Or if I'm this dementia-ridden person, or someone else, or someone that gets to the end of your life and you're not quite who you used to be, like, what represents you in heaven? Is it an amalgam of who you were, an average of who you were over time, or was it your best you at some arbitrary point? Who gets to decide what the best? It's you at the age of 37 and a half, rather than you. And you get all these really interesting thought experiments about what it is that represents you in heaven. Do you get to take your vices with you? Like if you're someone that gets really angry on occasion, where imagine your internet goes out in the middle of a talk, like you're that, and you're just burning with rage, but it's only internet outages that make you burn with rage. Did you take that with you into heaven? What if you like class A drugs, if that's something that really floats your boat, but you're actually a really nice guy or girl, and you're in, that's part of who you are, and it gets taken away from you as you're in heaven. So this idea of heaven is a real problem. And of course, the idea of free will in heaven as well is huge, but that's another argument. What if I die, as I say, as a baby, as a blastocyst? How do I get defined? And yeah, lots of arguments to do with that, but I sort of rushed through that and butchered it as an argument. But there you go. There are plenty more. I think I got up to sort of 23, and there's 30 arguments in total, and there's lots more to do with heaven and hell. But there you go.
Okay, thank you. We're going to open up the floor to Q&A. So, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Real quick, I just want to say that, honestly, that power outage and or the Wi-Fi outage was probably the closest thing I've seen recently to what could constitute an act of God. It's kind of funny. Just want to say that. Yeah.
That So it's really difficult. It's really difficult for me to hear you. Was there a question in there?
No, sorry, I was just commenting on how funny the internet outage was. Like,
I know, but it's funny. Like it's very easy to connect these things, and then there will be someone else sitting out. There's someone out there sitting watching this video, going, "Yeah, I knew God existed." Just and people will find evidence in anywhere. But there you go.
Can you hear me now? Jonathan?
Sorry,
Can you hear me?
it's quite difficult for me to hear you, but go for it.
Speak directly into this. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, well, I just want to speak directly into this.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions from YouTube, from the live stream.
Yep.
There's one here. Does the Bible not predict the demise of the big lie that is God? That is the great harlot being thrown out of heaven, as in the book of Revelations.
Does the Bible not predict what?
The demise of the big lie that is God, that is the great harlot being thrown out of heaven, as in the book of Revelation.
Yeah, I had to say, I'm going to say I don't know. The book of Revelations is probably the book of the Bible I know the least. So that's really unfortunate. It's just not one I've studied, particularly. Like most of my writing on the Bible has been to do with the Nativity and with the resurrection, where I've taken the four main Gospels and gone to town on them. So I'm no big knowledge on the book of Revelations. I think the Revelation, as far as I understand it, book of Revelations, you can probably take most things from that. When it comes down to interpretation, there's a lot of wiggle room, isn't there? And something like that, which has an awful lot of symbolism, means that you've got an awful lot of wiggle room for interpretation. But that's me sort of fudging an answer. The simple answer is I don't know, and I'm sorry. But we should be cool with saying I don't know as well. That doesn't happen enough.
Another question. Having an OmniGod ends up with plenty of logical issues, but if we nerf the concept, which arguments would be the most potent against it? Let's say an imperfect God with limited knowledge and power.
Yeah, so this is where one of the arguments that theists use to argue for God is the ontological argument. And this is kind of like, there's nothing greater than, this kind of idea that you can imagine of God. And if you can imagine something greater, then that would be God, sort of thing. That's a bit of a butchery of it. But it would just seem bizarre if you've got a God. I mean, these are kind of what the gods of old were in many different contexts. Whether you look at it in the Norse gods or whatever pantheon of gods, you have very human anthropomorphic gods that aren't these kind of ultimate gods. So what happened? In fact, there's a great book I'd advise anyone to get. It's called God and Anatomy. I don't know if you can see that. I can't see myself on the TV anymore, on the screen anymore. It's Francesca Stavrakopoulou, God and Anatomy. And that's a really interesting book, because it talks about how God in the Hebrew Bible was originally a kind of a corporeal God that walked amongst men and women that had like body parts and all sorts of stuff going on. And then over time, literally over sort of 2,000 years plus, we have abstracted God to be this kind of OmniGod thing that is so different from this original understanding of God, that people who have done the philosophy and understood God to be this abstract God, say OmniGod, really struggle to then marry that with the God of the Bible that isn't like this OmniGod. And there's this tension between the philosophy of OmniGod and the theology and kind of anthropology, if you like, of those early biblical texts. And I think somewhere between that is a kind of God that is less than. So of course you can imagine all these sort of gods that have less than, perfect knowledge and less than perfect power. But then you're thinking, well, there are better gods than that. It's just, it basically degrades God. And in principle, I suppose you can imagine that. I think a lot of theists would have problems with saying, yeah, God's really powerful. It's just not that powerful, or God's really, really knowledgeable, just not like supremely knowledgeable. And I think it then just becomes a problem of arbitrary kind of where do you draw the line there. I think that you get this a lot with open theism, like I sort of hinted at before. So open theism being the idea that God doesn't know future freely willed events. And it's the idea that God can't predict what you would choose. If you've got free will, right, God can't predict that, because then that plays merry havoc with, designing, creating people, knowing that they're going to go to hell and creating them anyway such that they go to hell. So some theists get around this by saying, well, God doesn't know what they're going to choose in such a way that he creates them, but he doesn't know really that they're going to go to hell. And then you're thinking, well, yeah, okay, I can see why you're doing that to get around this problem. But then we've got an algorithm for Facebook that can predict human behavior, like after 300 likes, such that Facebook knows your human behavior better than your own partner after 300 likes, right? And that's mental. Now, if we can predict human behavior with algorithms better than God, then it renders God really, God's supposed to have created the entire universe, all the physical constants. You say God is all this amazing stuff, but then can't really predict how humans will decide in a given situation. I mean, we're doing a pretty good job at that just with science at the moment, and psychology and sociology. So I think you can start arguing for God and moving God around in that P, that con man's game of a pea under a shell, and moving God into areas that, okay, these three characteristics, yeah, I admit they don't really make very sense. So I'm gonna take God back to this slightly less than, but I think that's ultimately unsatisfactory, certainly for theists. I mean, for me, it doesn't really matter what kind of God you argue for. I think they're all problematic and don't do as good a job as explaining the data of the world as naturalistic atheism. But yeah, that would be my answer to that. Hopefully that answers that. It just degrades God.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi, thanks for the talk.
Thank you.
Now, for context for this question, I'm actually a Christian, but I noticed that most of your arguments are asking the question about the God to objects. I'm curious about your.
I can't hear a single word, unfortunately.
Can you hear me now?
It's really difficult, and I think the other microphone is probably better.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, much better.
Yeah, so I noticed that a lot of the arguments you had had a structure of asking the question, why would God allow X, or why would God do X? And I'm wondering how you address the epistemic problem of asking why question, because by definition, an OmniGod is infinitely knowledgeable, and for Jesus, you can't really expect to understand the inner workings of the mind. And we don't necessarily epistemically expect to.
I didn't catch the end of that, but the way I understand your question, correct me if I'm wrong, is a lot of my arguments are structured around, like, why would God do this? We wouldn't expect God to do that. But if we don't know the mind of God, then we're kind of second guessing what God would do or would want or would know, and that's a bit of a problematic move, because God is infinitely cleverer than us. Would that be right? Sorry?
Yeah, I think you said it well.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, that's a pretty good point. I mean, this is kind of a bit like skeptical theism. Skeptical theism is a position with the problem of evil that says basically you can't or don't know the mind of God, and God could have a reason for doing X, Y, and Z. And it's this, I call it a possibiliter ergo probabiliter sort of fallacy, if it's used in a particular way, which is like, yeah, God could have a reason for allowing X, Y, and Z amount of suffering. We don't know what that reason is, or we might not be able to know what that reason is, but there could be a reason. And that's fine. You know, there could be a reason. This is why there are two different types of arguments for the problem of evil. One is the logical problem of evil, and one is the evidential problem of evil. The logical problem of evil tries to deductively argue that God can't exist because suffering exists, right? But the problem is that the theist will come back with skeptical theism, which says that, well, there might be a reason, there could be a reason. Yeah, okay, there could be unicorns, but it doesn't mean there are unicorns. So I guess one way of looking at that would be like, okay, but the burden of proof is possibly on the theist to suggest at least a plausible reason as to why you know, this data does exist, and you claim that God exists. If you're claiming that God exists, I need something better than there could be a reason why this might happen. There's something in philosophy called phenomenal conservatism. Phenomenal conservatism is basically saying that in the absence of a defeater, I have a good justification believing my philosophical intuitions. So my philosophical intuitions are that if I'm looking around the world and I'm seeing tsunamis with 240,000 people dying, and if I'm seeing all these design problems, all the stuff that I've talked about during the whole talk, then absent of any defeaters, I'm justified in thinking these are good arguments to suggest that God doesn't exist. Now, to say that there could be reasons, you can't know the mind of God, you don't know the mind of God. Yes, I accept that. So what I'm doing is establishing a kind of probability. I think it's highly unlikely that God exists, given all these arguments. Now, unless you provide me really good arguments to suggest that God does exist and explain all that data, then I think I'm justified in saying God probably doesn't exist based on all these things. I mean, we are obviously having to second guess God's mind here, of course, but then if God fails to come down and tell us stuff that we would expect, there's one analogy I often use, which is like if I had a toddler and the toddler stamped on a flower bed, right? And I took my toddler away from outside the school where it stamped on a flower bed, and I took my toddler home and I beat my toddler senseless and I gave it cancer, right? But never told him why I'd done that. Like, you'd think that would be absolutely morally abhorrent, right? The poor little toddler's like stood on some flowers, and I've punished that toddler, but I haven't had the decency to come down and say, come to that toddler and tell him why I'm punishing him, such that he won't do it again. I've literally just given him horrific punishments. Now, the same goes with God. Like, if God isn't going to come down and express his own mind to us, and then expect us all to believe, given all this terrible data that I can provide you with, then I think it's incumbent upon God. You know, I don't think it's good enough to give me rationality and expect me to believe with blind faith. I think it's incumbent upon God to come down and say, oh, yeah, do you know that tsunami where I killed 240,000 people? Right. The reason I did that was because of this, or at least there is a reason. Even if you don't understand it, there is a reason. But to rely on a 2,000-year-old book to provide me with the kind of rationale for that, I think is deeply problematic. I don't know if that fully answers the question, but that would be what I had to say.
Hey, Jonathan, Sohan here. I think that segs well into my question, which is about even if let's just grant that there are good, so-called good reasons. Would you please expand on that with the problem of evil and God as a consequentialist?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, this is one of my arguments in the book, or I allude to it in the book. It's actually a chapter of one of my other books, which is God as a consequentialist. So just to explain really quickly, consequentialism is the moral value system that many theists don't like, because you don't need God for the morality. So there are lots of flavors of consequentialism, can get really, really nuanced, but broadly speaking, it's like the consequences of an action are what how you derive moral value. So, for example, if I'm kind to you and it makes you happy, then it's the making you happy that derives the moral value to me being kind type thing, or my intentions. There are different ways of looking at it, but it's the consequences that give you the moral value. Now, the problem that why theists generally don't like it, William Lane Craig called it a terrible ethic, is because you don't need God for it. So we can have consequences as a perfectly fine secular moral value system. And in fact, utilitarianism is a version of it. Now, where it's interesting with regard to God and theodicies and the problem of evil and suffering is that all the reasons given, like, for example, the free will theodicy, well, if you're, it's the consequence of having free will. All this suffering is made worth it because, you know, you get to have free will, or, you know, God killing everyone in Noah's flood, right? Being able to start, you're all wicked, we're going to start again, and we get to start again, and this is great, and we're going to have this much better world, and that, you know, the consequences of having a much better world is what justifies me killing out all of humanity and all the animals. And when you look at all of the actions in the Bible, or any kind of, actually generally any kind of monotheistic actions of a monotheistic God, actions of a monotheistic God, it appears that all of it seems to be very consequentialist. So these bad things happened for a greater good. And as soon as you start saying this happened for a greater good, whether the greater good is having free will, or the greater good is my soul getting built up, so that suffering happens so that my soul could be built into a better soul, or whatever, you are using moral consequentialism, and that's fine, and that's fine for me, because I think I don't want to get into long weeds of how no moral value system actually works. They're all imperfect, but basically, as a rule of thumb, consequentialism is fairly useful, and we do use it all the time. But if Christians or theists hate it, as they often do, they've got a really big job to explain, well, if you hate it so much, why is it used in the Bible all the time? Why does it appear that whenever you are trying to excuse or explain why there is this terrible suffering, you use consequentialist ethics? It's for this greater good. As soon as they say it's for this greater good, they are inviting in moral consequentialism. I don't know if that answers your question, but that I think moral consequentialism is a really interesting idea in how it works with the problem of evil. Someone like William Lane Craig, again, to use him as an example, he tries to get around that by saying God's not a moral consequentialist because God is not moral. He says God is not a moral agent because he has no duties. He has no moral duties. He can't have duties to himself. He's just not a moral agent. And I just think that's got loads of problems in and of itself. But if you're really bothered about that, you can check it out. I've got a whole chapter on why God is a consequentialist, and then the answers to the criticisms in why I'm atheist and not a theist, how to do knowledge, meaning, and morality in a godless world. But that's, you know, if you're interested enough in that to read that.
Well, consequentialism is useful for us though, because we're kind of stuck in the world with certain, limitations, and that's just how the world is. Like someone, I suppose, like a parent giving a child a vaccine and holding them down and, you know, stabbing them with the needle is kind of stuck in a world where there are pathogens, and if they could just snap away the pathogens, they it wouldn't be excusable to force a child to, you know, take a vaccine, for example. So, I mean, given that there are no restrictions for God, can we just say that is consequentialism even, you know, in that context, is consequentialism even a possible excuse for what God does?
Well, actually, the vaccine example is a really useful analogy to explain consequentialism. So you say you're going to get this painful prick in your arm that will hurt, but actually it's going to bring about a greater good, which is you're going to be immune to a certain disease, right? So, and a child might not understand that. And this kind of also talks about sort of skeptical theism as well. So a child might not understand why they're getting an injection, but actually it's for the greater good, and it's a small amount of pain brings about a greater good. Okay, fantastic. So there's a really interesting argument around this by a philosopher called Stephen Mateson, and he's written a paper called "Ordinary Morality Implies Atheism," and he says that because there can be no gratuitous suffering at all, like it's impossible to have gratuitous suffering if you're a theist, there can't be any. It means that whatever suffering there is necessarily brings about a greater good. so if you look at a granny on the other side of the road getting beaten up by a thug, right? That can't be gratuitous. It's that if God is all loving, then that episode of that granny getting beaten up will bring about a greater good. It necessarily has to, otherwise God is not all loving. Now, the thing about that is what Stephen Mason says is it brings about moral paralysis. It says, really, if you really believe that, and you're a Christian, for example, who believes that, you should not go and stop that granny getting beaten up. You should let every bit of like what seems like moral harm, you should let it happen. You should look at that granny and saying, if I stop that thug beating you up, then I will be stopping a greater good coming about necessarily from that. And I shouldn't be doing that because obviously that's invalidating a greater good. So what I should do is not go and stop the granny getting beaten up, and the granny will get beaten up, and that will allow a greater good to come about. Isn't that brilliant? So one of the arguments that Stephen Mason proposes in that is that really, if you really believe in these kind of theodicies of greater goods coming about, then that should lead to moral paralysis, and you shouldn't actually go and help anyone. And of course, that's nonsense. It defies ordinary morality as he defines it. And so therefore, he says ordinary morality presupposes or implies atheism. It's an interesting paper.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
Okay, good. So my question is, why do you need any other proof other than the newborn baby has not done anything bad? Why kill it? If God is so omnipotent and he has so much power, why kill something so innocent that definitely did not do anything wrong, right?
Well, yeah, and exactly. And what the theist has to say is that that baby will just go to heaven. It's all justified in heaven. There is an argument that I talk about in a book, which is that if you believe, for example, in that baby going to heaven, then actually that is compensation. It's not moral justification. So, for example, if I walk up to David and punch him clean in the face and break his jaw, then that's pretty harsh. I can give David $5,000 afterwards and he might feel a bit better about himself, but it doesn't morally justify what I've done. What I'm doing is I'm paying him $5,000 and as a compensation for a moral harm. It doesn't make that morally good unless you really believe in a very strict form of consequentialism. So theists, when they often invoke heaven, what they're doing is invoking compensation as opposed to moral justification. So if a baby dies and goes to heaven, that baby is getting compensated, but it doesn't make it a good thing that that baby died of like childhood leukemia or something. So yeah, I would agree with you. Like, I think, you know, just a baby dying in and of itself is pretty problematic.
But if that's the case, then the very simple and basic, easy argument to that is, would you choose to die in order to go to heaven, or would you rather live your life first?
Well, I'd have to know what heaven is. I mean, that's an interesting question. Actually, so this is a really good point that's brought up by quite a lot of people. I don't know if you're angling for an anti-natalist viewpoint. So there are some people who argue that actually, if you really are a committed, like I use Christian as an example, if you really are a committed Christian, and if it's true that most people are, probabilistically, most people are going to go to hell for eternity, if that's what you believe, then really you should kill your child as soon as it's born, because you would be giving it a short, it would be definitely assured heaven for eternity rather than running the risk of going to hell for eternity. And of course, that's a really problematic thing to say, but it kind of follows logically.
Why do you think it's a problematic thing to say? I would say that you misunderstood my question. The theist tells me what your first original answer was, question, then I would tell the theist, okay, if you think that it's better to go to hell than to die, why don't you kill yourself so you can go to heaven? Or why don't you kill your babies?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So yeah, I agree with you. So of course it's problematic because theists don't want to do that. I mean, it's a problem for them. It's not a problem for me because I don't believe in any of that. But I think, yeah, you know, if you get these kind of really weird, or not weird, but interesting thought experiments where you say exactly that actually if your baby ends up dying straight away, then that's a good thing because that baby is assured heaven.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we have. Jonathan, I want to thank you so much for doing this talk with us today. I know it's really late in the UK, so thank you for doing this with us. Really enjoyed it. They're clapping.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can hear it. They're clapping. Yeah, I really like the moral lens on a lot of your arguments. I'm gonna send your book to one of my friends. I think you'll enjoy it. So thank you.
Yeah, no, look, thank you so much. And I just have to massively apologize. My internet is still not back on. So it's a local outage that has happened like up and down the road rather than just my house. And like, what are the chances? And, you know, maybe, as I said earlier, maybe God does exist because he's trying to suppress me. I've been cancelled.
Yep. So anyways, thank you. Hope your sickness gets better. And yeah,
Thanks, man.
all right.
Appreciate that. Yeah, cheers. Thank you very much, guys.